Hi, Faisal. Good to see you again.
Great. So welcome everyone again to the Conduit, and thank you for coming to this breaking news special event. I'm going to hand over without further ado to our co-founder, Paul Fansale, who will in turn introduce each of our esteemed panelists this evening. So please give a warm round of applause and welcome to our esteemed panel.
So good evening, and welcome to everybody who's joining us online. We have a huge online viewership tonight, so we're, and unsurprisingly given the subject matter, and you in front of us here are a live studio audience who have braved a transport strike to be here. So we're, yes, exactly. So thank you very much for coming. We were due tonight to speak to Christina Lamb and Philippe Sands about the Commission of International Crimes Against Women. Christina has gone to Ukraine and Philippe has COVID. So at a moment's notice, Freddie and Prandera Smith, our Impact Champion, threw this event together. And it is astonishing to me, the star-studded group of people who you're about to hear from tonight. These are extraordinarily gifted, knowledgeable, a more appropriate set of commentators one could not wish for, and at this extraordinary moment of history. So I'm going to do a very quick run through of who they are. They have very long resumes. I'm not going to embarrass myself or them by going through them. You can Google them, you can look them up. You should expect that they are prominent and interesting people. So we have Bishop Kenneth Nowakowski, who is a bishop of the Ukrainian Catholic Diocese in London, and he is joining us here live. We have Michael Bociurkiw, who is currently in Lviv, and he is on the screen and waving to us. We have Timothy Garton Ash, a historian, an author, a student of democracy, and a scholar who is joining us online. Welcome, Timothy. We have Andrei Soldatov, who is an investigative journalist, a Russian security service expert, and a person who will be giving us a very interesting insight onto on-the-ground military affairs in particular. And we have Natalia Antelava, who is a co-founder and editor-in-chief of Coda Story, which reports on major currents shaping our world, from disinformation, authoritarian technologies, and the war on science. So just a very, very interesting group of people. And so I'm going to start off with Timothy Garton Ash. And I'm going to ask you two very small questions. Brace yourself. You've met Vladimir Putin. In some ways, he is a proxy for nostalgic Russian authoritarian nationalism. So how did we go from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the invasion of Ukraine? And how central has Putin himself been to that transformation?
Was that one question or two?
You can answer it as sub A, sub B.
Okay, listen. First thing I want to say, before I talk about Vladimir Putin, let me talk about the Ukrainians, because like everyone else, I'm just completely lost in admiration for the extraordinary Ukrainian resistance we've seen over the last few days, military, territorial, and civil resistance. It's transformed the image of Ukraine, not just in Europe, but in the world for good. And can I also say, because the Frontline Club is sponsor of this event, it's also been a great moment for frontline journalism. I mean, we have a lot of fantastic, very brave colleagues. And, you know, the Ukrainian saying is Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, and I would say Journalistam Slava, glory to the journalists. Now, that said, to answer your question, actually, in a way, the question contains the beginning of the answer, because the largest surviving continental land empire, namely that of Russia, the Soviet Union, softly and suddenly vanished away in 3 years, just 3 years, without hardly a shot fired in anger. Something totally unprecedented. And of course, many Russians, amongst them a KGB officer in Dresden called Vladimir Putin, hated that. Putin said it was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. When I met him in 1994, then an insignificant deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, he was already complaining about the lost Russian territories, and he specifically mentioned Crimea and all those Russians, what he called Russians outside Russia, who Russia had a duty to protect. So you see, the fundamental reason is the empire strikes back. Don't let anyone tell you it's all because of NATO enlargement. 1994 was way before NATO enlargement. It is a classic pushback after the loss of empire. And we got there by degrees, Paul, so it's worth saying, initially he accepted it. 2008, he took pieces of Georgia, very little response from the West. 2014, he seizes Crimea and the first Russian invasion of Donetsk and Lugansk, of the easternmost parts of Ukraine. And again, for me, that's a great missed opportunity. That's the moment when the West should have woken up. And if we had done then what we are doing now, military support for Ukrainian defense so the country can defend itself, major sanctions on Russia, decreasing our energy dependence instead of increasing it in Europe, starting Nord Stream 2, we would be in a much better position today. So I think you're right. The story goes back, it's our fault that we didn't wake up sooner to the backlash that we should have expected.
So that then leads to my second question, and it's a big macro question. We're going to now go very micro facts on the ground, but I want you to sort of posit something that we will revisit in the course of this conversation, and that is, there was a moment in which we lived in the end of civilization in a unipolar world in which human rights was ascendant. And then in some ways, the West went to sleep. And in some ways, you could argue that we all thought that the price you pay for democracy and human rights is buying things and consumerism. And now we're in a world where Germany is about to add 100 billion euros to its defense budget. And the world has woken up to the idea that democracy and human rights is something that occasionally you may have to fight for. And if you think about the period immediately post-World War II, where we had the United Nations, the birth of the international human rights infrastructure, in some ways we had a flourishing of human rights in the wake of a genocide. Depending on how what we all do now plays out, is there not an argument for optimism that if we wake up and we fight and we stand up for our values, that this moment may be remembered retrospectively as one in which we advance the things that we all too often took for granted?
Who is that question to?
You.
Right. Listen, if we didn't wake up when there's a major war in Europe, when the fuck were we going to wake up, right? I mean, it's pretty bloody late to wake up. So now everybody in the Western Europe and Brussels is patting ourselves on the back and saying, wonderful, strong European response, great Western unity, and so on. But, if this is a wake-up call, it's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I don't think we should congratulate ourselves too much, also because I'm sorry to say that even tonight and in the next few days, we're going to see the most enormous violations of human rights in Ukraine. Because the Russians have not been winning, they're going to go back to the tactics we saw in Chechnya and Syria heavy artillery and besieging cities. So this is a terrible, terrible moment for human rights. But where I agree with you is it's too early for despair. I mean, you know, more of Europe is more whole and free than it has ever been in modern history. And right into the Baltic states, into Romania and Poland, the basic structures are more or less holding. We just have to defend them much more vigorously than we've done in the last 30 years.
So, Michael, I'm now going to come to you. And in some ways, you have a citizen's eye view. You're in Lviv. It's in the West. So in some ways, for now, God willing, it's sheltered from the worst. But tell us a sense of people on the ground, ordinary Ukrainians. Give us a sense of the mood right now where you are.
Sure. And by the way, we've suffered quite a deterioration in internet today. So if you can't hear me, let me know and I'll click off and go on mobile data. The situation here is very, very dire indeed. What Timothy just said about Russian tactics turning to the much darker side is, I think, very true. Just a few hours ago, the Kiev TV tower was blown up, hit by a Russian missile. It's situated not only in Kiev, but it's situated on the territory of Babyn Yar. And as Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister of Ukraine, just tweeted on September 29th, 30th, 1941, Nazis killed over 39,000 Jews here. 80 years later, Russian Nazis strike the same land to exterminate Ukrainians, evil and barbaric. I was talking to a lot of folks today. Well, every day I talk to a lot of folks. And those that are involved in humanitarian aid and strategizing what to do next are extremely concerned about a siege strategy being employed by the Russians, surrounding major cities, already cutting off supply chains which were strained already due to COVID and other things, to the point where we're getting messages from people in the capital of no food available in supermarkets. The most vulnerable, the elderly, are sitting in their apartment buildings too scared to go because the curfews have been quite long and the queues outside supermarkets, they've been sending me pictures, they're very long. So huge concern there. Where are we? On the doorstep of Europe in 2022, people starving in one of the major capital cities in Europe. It's almost unfathomable. I'm sure you've read, and I meant to make one more point about the TV tower. I remember in 2014 when the Russian-backed thugs basically strolled into Donetsk. We were there as part of the OSCE. And what was the first thing they do? They took television off the air and they replaced it with propagandistic Russian state channels. Just after a few hours ago, after I finished an interview on Ukrainian television, that's when that explosion happened. And by the way, since we're a lot of journalists listening here, it's unbelievable the efforts that Ukrainian journalists have been putting in to keep the story out there 24/7. And in an unprecedented move, the competing channels have actually got together and they're doing a 24/7, what they call a marathon here of broadcasting, oftentimes from a bunker, a bombshell bunker. So, you know, we really have to salute them. And I think this is a discussion henceforth, finding ways to support them because they're going through terrible times right now. And many of them actually have been displaced. The other thing that's happening here, just closer to where I am, I think almost overnight, Lviv has been transformed from a pretty quiet city that until now has been left untouched by the violence, thank God, to a city overwhelmed. Traffic jams all over today, hotel rooms fully booked, private accommodation booked. So a lot of people, understandably, have come from other centers which have been bombed towards here. The scenes at the Lviv train station are horrific. A lot of women and children there in very dire circumstances, crowded in trying to get onto trains to the border. The border situation, catastrophe, nothing short of a catastrophe. We're hearing now, and this is from, for example, CNN correspondents who are also trying to cross, waits of up to 40 hours to cross. Andrew Ninka, the editor-in-chief of the Ukrainian Weekly, he crossed 2 days ago at the Polish border here. He standed on foot for 27 hours. The nighttime temperatures now are falling well below zero, and there's snow on the ground. So I don't want to fall into the trap of doing Monday morning quarterbacking, but a big problem seems to be from eyewitnesses on the ground there are checkpoints along the way put up by the Ukrainian authorities. And a big part of the process is checking the documents of males, Ukrainian males, between the ages, I think it's about 18 to 58 or something like that, because they are banned from leaving the country unless they have some good reason, a medical certificate, that sort of thing. So they're being turned back. You have nuclear families being split up because of that. I have received firsthand reports from those who have crossed. They get a very good reception at the Polish border. Poles are doing incredible humanitarian work and reception work. The problem is, once they go further into Poland, say Warsaw, they can't convert their currency. None of their credit cards or debit cards work. So they're stuck in a very, very bad place. So what I've been calling for is for Western friends of Ukraine to gently suggest that a humanitarian corridor open up. I know there's some controversy attached to that, but you can't have, in this climate, that many people sitting put. Cars are running out of petrol, that sort of thing. It's really bad shape. And I'm also advocating for, and cut me off if I've talked too long, I'm also advocating for friends of Ukraine, like Canada, like the United States, to immediately, like today, not tomorrow or the day after, send teams to those areas to help process the migrants crossing. We need, and I know, again, there's a bit of controversy surrounding this, but we need an emergency resettlement program, at least temporarily, for people to get safe haven, because the bordering countries are becoming quickly overwhelmed. And don't forget, they've also been carrying the burden, not the burden, but the caseloads of refugees, migrants from many other countries. So this has, I know there's a lot of delicate points involved here with migration and so on, but we're facing a humanitarian catastrophe on many points on the border and in those major cities. One last point, if I can. What really worries me about the tactics left to the Russians, we have proof that they've imported some of their deadliest weapons, I don't know the full name of it, the thermal weapon that was used with deadly consequences in Chechnya. God forbid they start unleashing those. They've already unleashed bombs on schools, on places to worship and so on. They've been using cluster bombs. So if they start using those types of weapons, we're going to have devastating consequences. So I think that's about my summary. I'm open to other questions as well.
Thank you very, very much. Please come through. Absolutely. So I'm going to pivot now to you, Andrei, because I think in a way what Michael has done is presaged some of the questions about what's going to happen and what is happening militarily. I think it's probably fair to say that at least in Putin's mind, the idea was a quick strike with effective troops, with little resistance, and an easy and early occupation. That is not what has happened. And I think both Michael and Timothy have said that this is likely to result in more brutal responses from the Russians. So give us your sense of how the Russian strategy has shifted from day 1 to day 6, and where you think the next couple days are likely to take us.
Oh, thank you. First of all, I wanted to say that I'm a journalist, but also I'm a Russian citizen. To be honest, I feel absolutely disgusted and appalled by what Putin is doing in Ukraine. Almost every Russian family has some relatives in Ukraine, including my family, and it's absolutely unthinkable what is going on. I've been covering the activities of the Russian security services for 23 years. And to be honest, what is going on right now is absolutely unprecedented, because our presumptions, which sort of worked for the first 20 years of putting them in power, now they are falling apart. For instance, we long believed that Putin, he trusts his people from the KGB, and these people define his mindset and his perceptions of the reality. What we see now, and we started seeing this over the last 4 years, I would say, increasingly, that the military are getting more and more important in Russian society. And when you have the FSB and the Russian foreign intelligence being a bit hesitant, well, the military are absolutely happy to go forward. Partly it's because the KGB and the successors were taught in Academy of the FSB and the Academy of Foreign Intelligence, and I was told these stories by almost everybody I know inside, a lesson that it took 3 departments of the NKVD to pacify the Western Ukraine after the war. So they know that it will be really costly. They do not want to do an occupation. The problem is that now you have other people who are calling the shots. And here we have a big problem, because we have a military commander, Sergei Shoigu, who is not a military commander. He has no military experience whatsoever. He has no military training, but he is the longest top-level Russian official staying in power for 30 years. He became a minister of another ministry in 1991, so he believes in himself, has been completely invincible, ready to take risks. And what he's seen recently was a chain of successes. The annexation of Crimea, he was successful where FSB failed. He was successful in Syria. Again, Russian diplomats failed, but he succeeded. And now he sees his chance to do something. And because he doesn't have this military training or education or experience, he doesn't envisage that there might be some consequences for his actions. And he's not a military strategist. And he doesn't think that he needs to listen to somebody in the military, but what should be done. The problem we are dealing now is that we have a mixed operation. So Putin has been personally obsessed with NATO bombings of 1999 in Belgrade for 20 years. He always blamed the West, but also he was sort of fascinated by the success. Like, you can bomb the country and a political regime change quite quickly. That's exactly what he wanted to do. But he believed that in this case, in the case of Ukraine, well, the bombing might last only a day, maybe just a few hours, and this country would collapse. So it would be fine just to send troops in immediately. And that, I think, was his tactical mistake. Now, the problem is that the military they do not know what to do next. They keep sending columns of troops. They kept ambushed by Ukrainians. The number of casualties is growing. Nobody knows what to do about these casualties. The idea of the Russian Ministry of Defense is just to keep silence and to deny that there are, any casualties. They admitted 4 people killed, as far as I remember. And their response to this crisis domestically is just a complete censorship. I just got news that the oldest Russian independent radio station, the radio signal of this radio station was switched off. And last time it happened in 1991, when we had a KGB coup d'etat in Moscow. And it's happening again right now.
So let me ask you the corollary of that, which is, if the Russian miscalculation, if it is a miscalculation, is that you didn't have quick collapse followed by acquiescence, but in fact what you have is staring at a long occupation. The Ukrainian set of incentives is to assert, both in actions and in fact, that is going to be the case. So tell us what the Ukrainian response has been, and how effective that's been in changing the Russian calculus?
Well, ambushes were quite successful, of course, but my biggest concern is that just by its nature, to hold big cities seems to be a very good idea. The problem is that, well, last time the Russian troops actually stormed a big city was during the Second Chechen War, and it was a horrible thing, because what they didn't storm the city, they bombed it to the ground almost. They surrounded the city and we waited for militants to try to break through, and then they killed them. So this kind of tactics in Ukraine, I just don't want even to think about it. It would be just a complete disaster. What we see now, we see that the Russian leadership, military leadership, is sort of confused and divided about what kind of military to use. They send in Chechens, they send in Rosguardia, well, actually the troops which have nothing to do with the military operations. They actually were built to beat up protesters on Moscow streets. Now these people, for some reason, sent to Ukraine. Of course, they get killed because they have no military training whatsoever. So it's a complete mess. And it's, to be honest, my fear that it gets messier and messier.
So Natalia, I'm going to now come to you. We've just heard from Andrei that the longest running independent radio station's just been taken off the air. I've also been told that Dost, the independent TV station, has now been taken off the air. And for those of you who don't know, last night we had an event at the Conduit with a really amazing film called, excuse my language, Fuck This Job, which was about the founders of that radio station and their really courageous decades-long struggle to be an independent media source. Now, this is your area of expertise, and in some ways, the conflict is both a physical conflict, but it's also a conflict for hearts and minds, and it's a fight around information. So tell us how that is in fact playing out. What is the playbook that particularly Putin and the Russian state is using in what is becoming a very highly contested propaganda war?
The war is always obviously about disinformation and the information warfare, but I think in many ways what we're seeing, the playbook, it seems to be out of the window. I think there is a lot of sort of panic that I'm seeing on the pages of the Russian state media trying to figure out what the narrative is. It's not quite working for them. But I don't think that's the important part here. I think the important thing is not so much, when I think of disinformation, it's not actually the fake news that interests me in it. It's the narratives that we create and we push. And I think what got us here is is Putin's narrative that the West has been completely complacent with. Timothy Garton Ash mentioned Georgia in 2008. It was incredible how many people called me after the first bomb started falling on Kiev and said, do you remember that red button? And that was my first thoughts too. As a Georgian, I remember the red button that Hillary Clinton presented to Sergei Lavrov in her first meeting as Obama's Secretary of State. It was a reset. It was a symbolic gift of reset of the relationship between the US and Russia. And the media at the time, the headline said, made fun of the fact and kind of laughed at the fact that the reset was misspelled in Russian. And Lavrov laughed at that. But the whole region gasped for air, literally, because we knew that Putin just got away with murder. And that's what we have seen ever since. For 15 years, he has been getting away with murder. In Aleppo, the MH17, 298 people, countless lives in Ukraine. In Britain, the Salisbury poisoning, Navalny, again and again and again, that man got away with murder. And he dragged everyone into, I remember being in Eastern Ukraine in 2015, well into the war. I mean, things have become pretty clear by then. And friends in Western networks and channels that I respect were putting out television pieces that had lines saying like, Ukraine is at war with itself. Ukraine was never at war with itself. Georgia was never at war. Well, maybe in the 90s you could have made this argument, but this is, this is what he has been doing. And the problem here, and I think, media played a huge role. And the problem, you can talk about the disinformation and the narratives, but the reason why we're here, we did not need to be in this place today. We did not need to be in the place with all these people hiding in their basements and going through some like weird Putin time machine back into the Second World War. And I think everyone is a little bit responsible for it, because the collective West for years and years has just refused to accept that Putin was at war with the West. Everyone has been told and warned. And I think this is a question that needs to be asked now by journalists, by the media, by the politicians, because, what's at stake? I'm in London at the moment. I'm based in Georgia. I'm Georgian. I don't know if I'm going to have a country to go back to in 2 weeks' time, because, while NATO will protect the Baltic states, that front line of Putin's hatred for the West runs not, is also Moldova, it's also Georgia, it's also every Russian who believes in liberal values, it's all those people. And so, and these are the things, having not done anything for these 15 years, on having done so far from enough and having lost so many lives, I think these are the questions that need to be asked now.
So stipulated, if we take the argument that there has been far too much appeasement and acquiescence and inactivity in the face of aggression and crimes and lies, and part of the response, therefore, has to be a much more robust defense of values and land and territory and individuals and nations, if necessary. There's still a question about modern information warfare, about who controls the narrative, in your own words, which stories are told, which crimes are properly reported, how the West's attention is shaped in the face of what we fear might be some terrible atrocities in the days ahead. And just before we went live, I spoke to a very, very senior person in a very large tech company, who was saying to me that they're really grappling right now with what their responsibilities are, how much information to allow to flow so that the message gets out. And last night we heard that some of the most courageous journalists didn't want Google to be switched off, in their words, not mine. But on the other hand, there's also a sense of not letting lies and misinformation and propaganda be propagated and trying to switch that off. So this is your domain. So tell us your sense, if you were speaking to this individual who may well be listening tonight, what should they be doing in terms of allowing information to flow, and on the other hand, allowing the wrong kind of information, stopping the wrong kind of information?
Well, I mean, first of all, they should have been doing it a really long time ago. This is not a new problem that they have. This is not a new problem. And that's part of it's just, it's again, the tech companies are waking up to the fact that, and I was talking to a friend today, a Ukrainian friend, who was saying they're finally taking down the accounts that we've been asking them to take down. This is exactly part of the same basically answer that I gave you earlier. They know what they need to be doing. Whether they have human capacity to be doing it is another matter. I mean, and then we are going to get into the kind of the regulation. I mean, this is why the question of regulation of the tech giants is an urgent question that urgently needs to be dealt with, because we can't be coming up with the rules and regulations while in the middle of the war zone. This had to be done before, because we've had plenty of precedents. I mean, we were doing stories 6 months ago, a year ago, about YouTube, refusing to pull down videos of Belarusian torture victims. Like it has a problem. It is a problem that has persisted. So, you know, I'm not in business of like telling tech companies, you know, what it is that they need to be doing. I think there is plenty of advice that they have had, and there is plenty of, you know, there is plenty that they could be, and obviously a lot is being done right now. But again, it's too little, too late. You know, so sorry, I realize I'm not giving you a satisfactory sort of answer on information battles. And of course, the information battle is going on. It's part, you know, and there's loads of disinformation on both sides. And but I mean, in terms of the narrative, you know, I mean, Zelensky has the narrative. He is, you know, the president with, you know, balls that you can see from space. Like he's got story is him, and that's why Ukraine has the narrative and the contrast between them. So right now, that's narrative. But how long will it last for? We don't know. And if Zelensky is gone tomorrow, which is, you know, highly possible and very likely, and if the West gets a little bit tired of, you know, the flows of refugees and the ongoing, you know, if it turns into another Sarajevo and so on, then Putin will get in there with a new narrative, and he's trying to, there are already signs that he's trying to come out with ways of kind of puncturing it.
Thank you. I want to now turn to the role of the church, and I'm incredibly grateful that you made time to be with us tonight. In some ways, a church can be a provider of assistance, a minister to people in harm. It can be a peacemaker. It can be a liberator. And it can be all of those in different ways. So what role do you think, from your very important position right now, stretching across both Ukraine and Russia with people of faith in your church, what role do you think the church should be playing?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here this evening with you. Freedom of the press and freedom of religion, I think, walk in hand in hand. In the 1990s, I was part of a delegation that went into the Soviet Union in April of 1990. We had about 30 journalists with us from the West, and we went into Ukraine to look at what perestroika and glasnost was doing regarding religious freedoms. As a test point, is glasnost and perestroika just fancy words that people came to learn and now, of course, have forgotten what they meant and forgot those terms? I think that if we look through the history of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation now, any time where we've seen Tsarist occupation of Ukraine, we've seen the suppression of church. When we've seen it during the Soviet Union, we've seen the brutality of the suppression of the church, not just the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, but also Orthodox churches, Catholic churches, and other religions as well. Now, when we're seeing Putinism, everywhere that Putin has put his hands on, the church also is suffering, whether it's Crimea, the Donbass, and other areas in the Russian Federation. So the role of the church is, especially here in the West, is now to be the voice of the voiceless, to speak about not just our own religious domination, but what religious people and leaders are dealing with right now. We're there to give hope. We're there to give solidarity. On Sunday, our Patriarch Sviatoslav, who is in Kyiv, he had to make a horrible announcement that we've also seen here in the United Kingdom, where church leaders have had to say, don't come to church, but that was because of COVID here. And he's had to say, don't go to church on Sunday because of the martial law. And we felt it very important throughout the West to make sure that we were in churches in the West to be in solidarity with us and to show people in Ukraine, we all have smartphones, we're all in touch with each other, that they haven't been forgotten. And I think that we have to pray for victory, not just a military victory, but also a spiritual victory. And it might be a little bit ironic for me to say, but the defeat of Vladimir Putin will be the salvation of Russia.
So tell us a little about the potential for, there's obviously on again, off again, varying degrees of effectiveness, interstate peace talks. But there seems to be in a lot of conflicts, there's also the potential of inter-citizen dialogue and reaching across the aisle and having people from ostensibly the opposite sides of a conflict, but actually who have much more that unites them, that divides them, to be a bulwark against some of the forms of nationalism that you see demonstrated by Putinism. Is there a role for the church to play in trying to do this? Are you, in fact, trying to bridge the gap in some proactive way?
Well, here in the United Kingdom, I think what we're doing to help bridge that gap is this afternoon, I was with leadership of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church in the United Kingdom, and we met with the leader of the opposition. We had a very frank talk with him, and the deputy leader of the opposition expressed our concerns. On Sunday, Prime Minister came to our cathedral and met with our congregation and also with leaders of the Ukrainian community privately. And I also had an opportunity to speak with the Prime Minister and was able to express my concerns. And I think for me, the ability to speak to these leaders and be heard by them, of course, what they do after this is very much up to them, but at least they heard the point of view from the church, from a church that understands suppression, understands liberation. And I think if we can, as leaders of various denominations, not just Christianity, be able to speak with our leaders here in the West to help them understand what people of faith might be experiencing. I understand that there was a survey done 2 years ago that stated that 80% of Ukrainian population believes in God and practice their faith somehow. That's an incredible amount of people that, considering the length of time they were in a country, part of the Soviet Union, that suppressed religion, suppressed religious belief. But as soon as the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, I think we can see the churches being very strong, but also, going back to my first comment regarding freedom of the press. You suppress the churches, and that means you suppress freedom of the press as well.
James, thank you for joining us and for sneaking in, and it's great to have you. You are a former BBC Moscow correspondent since 1989. You've written a book called Assignment Moscow, reporting on Russia from Lenin to Putin. So I want to ask the question, we focused a little bit today about the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but I want to ask you a question about the battle within Russia, the battle for the soul of Russia and Putin's role within it. And do you think that the stakes in this conflict are so high that Putin may have made a massive strategic miscalculation, and this may have been the highest point of his power, and in fact, there are now the opportunity to contest that in ways that it never has been? Or do you think he's more likely to consolidate his grip and in the next 2 or 3 years, you will see him more entrenched and less freedom and more liberty squeezed out of the body politic?
After all that talk about the tech companies, I wonder if you've been looking at my computer this week. So I've just been writing newspaper articles going to be published later this week addressing exactly that. I haven't. Just to take a slightly longer view, I would say that having worked in Russia since the end of the Soviet period, and having seen, I was there when Putin first was elected president. I was reporting on Chechnya, which of course, where I start this article is arguing that he came to power in war and generally it has served him well. He's had successes which he's been able to portray as such at home. And I think you can divide his presidency broadly into two things. He started with the success in the Chechen War that saw him elected president in the spring of 2000. The first of his decades in power, he presided over a huge rise in living standards. That started to tail away. After that, in the last decade, he's built his reputation on restoring Russia's standing abroad, sometimes by force of arms. And I argued in an article I wrote about 18 months ago, I think he's run out of ideas. At the time when he had the constitutional vote, I wrote an article arguing that he needed new ideas, and I don't think any are forthcoming. So I wonder if he has miscalculated here. Clearly, he was probably the only person among a very small circle. The one question I'd love to know about what was going on in the Kremlin the last couple of weeks was how the CIA were getting their intelligence. Because even if the dates weren't quite right, what they predicted was pretty accurate. And I wonder if they have a source right within Putin's circle. But anyway, I think he and a very small number of people around him knew what was going to happen. And I wonder if after 20 years at the top and 2 years of being isolated for COVID, spectacularly isolated. I mean, everyone's been joking about those massive tables, but there is a serious point there. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were stories that people had to isolate for 10 days before they were allowed to go and meet him. So I wonder if he really has been living in a world of his own. And I also wonder if there's nobody picking up what Andrei said earlier. You know, he's not dealing with the intelligence services, who, as a former KGB officer, always told me, we were always the best informed people in the Soviet Union. And I think that has turned out to be true of post-Soviet Russia too. I wonder if nobody will tell him this is a bad idea and if he hasn't really thought this through. However, it looks like Russia will achieve its military objectives in the short term, and then after that, we'll see how it goes. But I can't say that he hasn't miscalculated.
Is there any sign that any of the targeted sanctions, any of the economic backlash, any of the decline in value of the ruble, any of the targeting of people's lovely homes in London, not enough, but at least a bit, are beginning to see cracks within his own elite circle? Is it too early to tell, or is there, reading the tea leaves, any sign of that?
I think it's probably too early to tell. There's a story the Financial Times had about what Mikhail Friedman had said, but apart from that, there's no sort of sign of mass cracks yet. I mean, as I'm sure possibly was said before I got here, you know, the cracking down on dodgy money in London comes too late, unfortunately. I mean, I think it's better late than never, but it's I suspect that many members of the elite who are likely to be affected by it have probably taken adequate precautions and possibly saw this coming.
Timothy, I want to come back to you. You've written a lot about the fate of liberalism and the liberal ideal. And I'd like, you know, I asked you, my second question I asked you was about going to sleep and being complacent. But if you were for a moment to sketch out what the defense of liberalism meant in real terms, military, political, cultural, economic, diplomatic, right now, in order for us to seize this moment and not for it to be lost, but to seize that opportunity to regain a footing, what would your prescription be? What should a coalition of willing nations be doing at this moment in response to this, not just now, but over the next decade, to refortify and defend this project?
Well, that's what the Germans call an abendfüllendes Thema. You could go on about it for a whole evening. Two things, perhaps, on that. First of all, sometimes we forgot that at the heart of liberalism is liberty, that freedom is the core value of liberalism. And I think this story is reminding us that in the first place, it's about defending freedom and equal freedom for all. Second point, this is the end of the post-Cold War era, 24th of February, 2022. We're now into a new long struggle. And in that long struggle, it's not just going to be about what we do over there, right? Or what we project in terms of foreign and security policy. It's about how strong, resilient, and attractive our own societies are. So if you like to bring it close to home, agendas like leveling up, which despite where it comes from is actually a great idea and exactly what we need, or Olaf Scholz's social democratic agenda of what he calls respect, are actually part of this long struggle because they're repairing the big faults that liberal societies fell into over the last 30 years when liberalism was reduced, to put it in shorthand, to neoliberalism. Two other quick points, if I may. on, because it connects very much to this, because another thing at the heart of liberalism is free speech. On the information war, let's be clear, the Ukrainians have already won the information war. They've won it hands down. Their narrative has won worldwide, and partly thanks to the platforms. I want to ask everyone who's listening or watching to follow the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, on Twitter. His Twitter feed is an absolutely extraordinary example of the use of social media to establish your narrative and make your case. And by the way, Babin Yar, which Michael mentioned, he immediately tweeted about very powerfully, saying, we kept saying never again. How is it possible that 80 years later, missiles are landing on Babin Yar? Final point, I think we need to be consistent in our belief in free speech. So I think Natalia may disagree with me. I think it's a bad idea to ban RT. I think it's good for our people to see the poisonous, evil propaganda narrative, to see the big lies. And by the way, if we ban RT, they go and ban Deutsche Welle or BBC. And what we lose by the ban on the BBC or Deutsche Welle is much more than what we gain by banning RT here. So I don't think we should ban it. But what I do think we should do, and this is my last point, is to call out the Oxbridge-educated, perfect English-speaking or German-speaking or French-speaking Western journalists who are being the purveyors of this shit, of these lies, in a tremendously elegant and sophisticated way. I really do think we've seen a few resignations from RT, but if they had any journalistic integrity or ordinary human decency, they would be resigning in droves.
Michael, I want to come to you because you sketched the humanitarian catastrophe that's unfolding. And I want to ask you a question that may be difficult and maybe a tricky one for humanitarians to answer, but which I think goes to the heart of some of the conundrums that we're facing. And that is, clearly we should be delivering humanitarian assistance in the countries that people are fleeing to. Clearly we should be providing corridors to provide assistance where people are if they're unable to move across borders. But there's also another form of assistance that the West is undoubtedly providing, and that is the provision of military hardware and the support of the struggle of the Ukrainian people or the Ukrainian military or the Ukrainian government. And where does that stack up in your judgment? And is that something that all governments at this point who are unwilling to put boots on the ground should be doing?
Yeah. I think the audio output's a bit poor quality, but I think I got the gist of your question on the humanitarian situation. Look, I'm probably going to get into a little bit of trouble for saying this, but sometimes in life you have to stick your neck out. I used to be global spokesperson for UNICEF in Geneva. I used to be spokesperson for UNICEF in the occupied Palestinian territories. As I'm reading right now, the latest statement by the UNICEF executive director, who, by the way, was appointed by the Biden administration. It's a long press release talking about the current situation for women and children. And in it, they're appealing for $276 million. Nowhere in that statement is the word Russian or Russia used. It's beyond belief. The world's most influential children's organization cannot bring itself to name the aggressor. If that's where we are in 2022, we're in a sad state of affairs. And I can tell you that I've spoken to other colleagues, current and former in the organization, and we're absolutely appalled that this is happening. It's not only this particular statement either. So anyway, I think it was someone else who spoke earlier who mentioned, I think Timothy, or Natalia as well, that we knew this was coming, this situation. And a lot of people said, no, they'll never invade, they'll never, not in this day and age. But because of that mindset, and I've worked a lot of complex emergencies all over the world, because of the mindset, there was very little pre-positioning going on. basic stuffs that, that we deliver, for example, on UNICEF to women and children, everything from psychosocial programs to, mattresses, blankets, nutrition for young babies. And now, with the situation that I described to you earlier, a lot of those capabilities to bring in emergency aid are cut off. I'm hearing from a lot of people in the diaspora, and God bless them for putting the efforts they have. They raised a lot of money, they're putting a lot of aid together, but it's really, really tough to get money into Ukraine right now, even through non-traditional means. And it's going to become increasingly difficult, I fear, to get humanitarian aid to where it's needed inside the country. I can tell you as well, what I'm hearing, there was very little preparation done for internally displaced people. In these types of emergencies, you don't want to encourage people to cross borders as much as you can. You want them to stay as close as possible to their homes, but of course, away from the violence. They're only now getting to the stage where they're converting schools and other public facilities to kind of safe havens for internally displaced people. So way behind the curve on this one. And I hope that, it's happened in Colombia and elsewhere where you've had, for example, days of tranquility, armed rebels of the worst kind you can imagine have actually laid down their arms for things like vaccination to take place, things like that. If this conflict carries on for much longer, I think, in those negotiations, they have to insist on those types of corridors or days of tranquility to happen just to save lives. Another point I forgot to mention earlier, we saw how Mr. Lukashenko in Belarus weaponized migrants, inviting them from various countries and then sending them over the border into the EU. I wouldn't put it past Mr. Putin, and I kind of hate to say this, but that he would inflict damage on heavily populated cities like Kiev in order to push people away, make them flee, and then seek a safer haven, for example, in neighboring countries. It's a very, very bad scenario, but that's, I think, the kind of a twisted mind we're dealing with at the moment. One final point, and this is really important because, and it's something I've been saying on air, is here in Lviv. I think many of you have been here. It's one of the most beautiful cities you'll find anywhere. It's basically an open air museum. Bishop Ken will tell you, you could do a 360-degree view right now, and you'll probably count 7, 8, 9 churches in one go. It's a center of faith. The Ukrainian Catholic University is here. This is where a lot of Ukraine's leaders in politics and literature and arts and even technology came from. I wouldn't put it past him either is that he would maybe just take a strike here just to send a message or to say, this is one more win, if you will, that I want to make. So that's why many of us are kind of bracing ourselves. By the way, there were quite a few air sirens today and yesterday. People here are really on edge. So we're hoping for the best here.
I know we're going to turn to questions from the audience, but Natalia, I want to ask you a question. There's one through line in tonight's conversation. It is the importance of liberty and speech and the people who convey it, and that's journalists. And this is an area that you work on a lot in relation to your work on information. But are there some specific things that you could recommend that people who are watching this, governments, diplomats, aid workers, philanthropists can be doing to support the architecture of information that flows out of this conflict right now in a way that both shapes it accurately, but also conveys the true cost of it in ways that may cause people to try and prevent the worst atrocities and respond more robustly when they occur? And you're on mute.
Sorry, third year into pandemic, I haven't learned. It's a really good question. I probably need more time to think about it, to come up with something more comprehensive and thorough. But I think the first thing, I think, be consumers, like consume widely and across the board and make it part of your daily, part of your life to really consume news. I think that's the most important thing. Obviously also, I mean, right now, there are obviously many journalists who need support, Ukrainian journalists who need support. But again, I think getting money into Ukraine is becoming more and more difficult. But there are some initiatives, and supporting that is really important. But you know what I mean, what journalists want more than anything else is being read. So I think doing that and sharing the stories and encouraging other people to read and engaging with the story in the way beyond kind of the war voyeurism that is inevitably going on. You know, this is, you know, there is always going to be a sense of, oh, it's a movie that's playing out on our screens. So that would be the first one. I actually, this may be a little bit more controversial. I would be curious to hear what other things, but you know, there've been few people tweeting not to give money to Western freelancers who are trying to freelance out of Ukraine, and this being frontline and so on. I actually support that, because I think there are quite a few inexperienced people who might be putting themselves into danger, and that shouldn't be encouraged. But the Ukrainian journalists, if you want to support journalism, I mean, there are Ukrainian journalists who really, you know, could do with that. But before you even do that, just read them. You know, read the stories that are being put out.
I'm going to ask you a final question, which is a specific military question. When you're in a conflict with a nuclear power and a deeply authoritarian leader, everybody is more circumspect about how they engage with that leader. And so in all the many debates around what to be doing, nobody has really said we should send in troops from Western democracies to stop the Russians. There hasn't been a serious argument about that, which in some ways you could make an argument for that, but leave that aside for a moment. Short of that, what should the West be doing to provide specific military assistance to an outgunned and very vulnerable and very asymmetrically oriented military in the form of the Ukrainians?
First of all, to be honest, I fear that some sort of direct confrontation between the Russian troops and NATO troops is sort of inevitable. And I think that's the way Putin sees escalation, and he's always been playing on escalation as a way out for him, out of any crisis. So I would be extremely worried for, say, NATO warships in the Black Sea and some other regions, because that's what for Putin means escalation. But apart from that, I think what could be done is, of course, we already see that there are big problems with logistics for all these troops. Ukraine is a big country, Russia is even bigger. Just to transport all these troops across Russia to Ukraine and then into Ukraine, and to provide with ammunition, with food, fuel and everything is a big, big challenge. And these days, these things are increasingly dependent on cyber. So everything is connected, everything is online. These things could be disrupted from outside. It doesn't mean a direct attack. It just means that you stop something from coming in another country to be used in attack. And I think that's something which is probably explored right now, and I think it's actually doable.
I know you're itching to ask questions, so I'm going to, Freddie and Co probably have microphones, and I'm going to turn it over to you to ask this really remarkable panel.
We do.
Nick.
Questions are pouring in online as well. So if we could take one before passing over to Nick from Mo Greig, who asks, and this relates to the Russian TV station that's just been closed down. How can we get information about what is really happening in Ukraine to the Russian population?
Let's take a bundle. So want to hand a microphone over to Nick? Somebody? Oh, go on.
It's a big question, and I won't frame it other than to ask, where is China in all of this?
Who wants to take the China question?
I can take China if you like.
Go for it.
The answer is sitting on the fence. They've been very, very careful. On the one hand, shoulder to shoulder, Putin and Xi Jinping at the opening of the Winter Olympics, common statement against the expansion of NATO. On the other hand, cautious comments about the importance of respecting sovereignty. In the UN Security Council, they abstained. They didn't vote with Russia. So they're sitting on the fence quite nervously, because if this tanks the global economy, they know that's very bad for them. And Xi Jinping's overwhelming concern is to keep the boat steady until he is re-elected, quote unquote, elected as leader for almost evermore next spring. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that short to medium term, they're going to be great beneficiaries from this geopolitically, because Russia's relationship with the West is gone for years to come, certainly so long as Putin lasts, and therefore Russia is going to become more dependent on China.
Could I add something quickly to this?
Please.
Yeah, so I've been writing quite a bit about this, especially for State and Opinion, and I can tell you that our friend Michael Vatikiotis will probably echo this, is that Xi Jinping is watching this very, very carefully to see what Mr. Putin gets away with in terms of the West intervening and inflicting pain. Because why? It's obvious, because this is a learning process for him once the time comes to make that grab for Taiwan. They've already sewn up Hong Kong, Macau. Taiwan is next. We don't know when, but whether they could make a grab for Taiwan, and whether the United States will follow through on its role as security guarantor for the island. The other important thing here, the other interesting thing, just quickly, is that when there was that vote, the procedural vote for the UN Security Council to discuss the Ukraine crisis before the violence began, it was very interesting to see the list of countries that abstained. So you saw India. That's because the Russians made a quick trip over there to twist some arms. But then you saw two interesting African countries, Kenya and Gabon. Why they too? So the reason is because they were recipients of brotherly fraternalism from Russia and China in the form of vaccine diplomacy. They got vaccines from either or both of those countries. So it was payback time. When you accept vaccines or cheap loans from China especially, you have to know the rules. You have to vote the way they do in the UN fora. And that's exactly what happened. They strong-armed Kenya and Gabon, just the same way they strong-armed Ukraine when they gave COVID-19 vaccines to Ukraine. And then they saw Ukraine's name on a list of countries criticizing their behavior for the way they treat Muslim minorities. So there you go, modern geopolitics at work.
Another question, please.
Andrei, it's Andrei Soldatov. Yeah. You gave us very interesting narrative about Shoigu and Putin, how they developed, what they become. I just noticed that when you were talking about Grozny in Chechnya, you said we bombed Grozny. Is it because Chechnya and Kadyrov is still sort of separate? Do you consider them separate, or can you tell us a bit more about Kadyrov? What his role in this conflict? Because again, when you were talking about Ukraine, you were talking they bombed Kyiv, they bombed. But when Chechnya, you said we. It's a very interesting play of words. Yep. Can I just?
Well, thank you. Well, my problem is that I cannot say we, the West, because I'm a Russian. So in this case, I always need to refer to the country, and maybe it's my mistake. I just need to say Russian troops bombed. But actually, it's a very interesting thing about Chechnya. It's indispensable to some extent, and in many regions, and the Kadyrov support is crucial for the Russian security services, and it's getting more and more crucial, not only militarily, but for instance, in some very surprising areas, like counterterrorism cooperation between Russia and the United States, because we are trading in intelligence information about Syria and about some other countries and about jihadists. And this information is mostly collected by Kadyrov's people, not by the FSB or Russian foreign intelligence. They are completely, well, they're not extremely competent. So they rely on Kadyrov in intelligence gathering. So it's important. They also need Kadyrov domestically in Moscow. When we had some crisis in Moscow, some big protest, you immediately see Kadyrov making some outrageous statement, and everybody got distracted because it's so horrible just to think that this guy might play a bigger role. And again, with Ukraine, the same tactics was used when the Russian troops were not making a big progress. Immediately, you got Kadyrov on all social media boasting about his people being sent to Ukraine. And the idea is just to spread fear, because everybody knows that these people, they know how to do that. So I think it's this relationship is much more closer when we think, but of course it's about the military and the security services. It's not about people. Ordinary Russians are still extremely afraid of Chechens. They're afraid of Kadyrov. They might sometimes praise him for being brutal, but it's mostly out of fear, not out of respect.
Another question.
We have an anonymous attendee on Zoom who asks, what will the consequences of sanctions be for Russian people living in the UK? We also have another person asking about the role of the church and the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia specifically.
Seems the second one has an obvious respondent.
The role of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia and the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the West is absolutely the same thing. They have to speak the truth. They have to support the truth. And that's what they need to do. Plain and simple. What is the truth? If I can just say, I was asked a question in an interview some time ago, if I had an opportunity to speak directly to President Putin as a church leader, what would I say to him? And I think this also would apply in the situation of the Russian Orthodox Church, that I'd ask him to look into his heart, hear conscience, and hear the voice of God saying, stop this war and become known as a man of peace.
Just to add on to that, I only recently read that he is actually very religious, and some people think that might be part of his motivation for all this. Has the church done everything it can to tell him, you will go to hell if you don't stop this?
Well, he claims that he's a Russian Orthodox believer, and I don't think it should be the church's responsibility, at least not the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church's responsibility, to tell him that he'll go to hell or to heaven if he doesn't do this or that. But I would ask that he certainly seeks spiritual advice. I know that the Russian people, the Russian Orthodox Church, are people of great faith. We have a common liturgy, and you can't be praying that liturgy every day for centuries and not believe in certain truths. And so I think that, yes, he needs to examine his own conscience, and it would be his own conscience that would help him know where his direction is.
Sir?
Thank you. Putin's been quite successful. Putin and Russia have been, sorry, was that?
No, sir, we'll do the microphone, then we'll come to you next.
Thank you. Been quite successful in sowing disunity in the West, and because there's a court case at the moment with the Observer journalist, is it Carol Calderwelder and Aaron Banks? So many of us believe that Russian money has been quite successful in sort of sowing that discord in politics in the UK, Brexit, for example, right-wing political groups across Europe, Donald Trump in the US. What should we do to respond to that use of sort of Russian money and those who have used, those in the West who have used that Russian money or allegedly to sow discord and sort of political disunity, which I guess in the last month, Putin's done just the opposite, seems to have actually reversed all of that disunity.
James, you look as though you're a candidate for that.
I mean, I think it's quite difficult to know what to do now. I mean, I think a lot of this has been happening for a very, very long time. You know, there are political parties here have received donations, some of which they're embarrassed about now. But I think it is quite difficult. I think the answer to that is to stop it happening anymore, which is difficult. And if I could just pick up on the question earlier about what it's going to be like for Russians in the UK now. I mean, as somebody who lived in Russia for many years, I obviously have Russian friends who live here, and I think it's going to be extremely difficult. And I have to say, when I first went to the Soviet Union on assignment in the early 1990s, I remember being in a supermarket in London and hearing someone speaking Russian and thinking, wow, you never hear that here. And now, of course, you know, in the last 20 years, you've heard it a lot. I think it's a tremendous loss. If you're at university here now, you're wondering, how on earth am I going to get home to see my family for the next vacation? I was at the film screening you mentioned last night, and the producer was wondering how she was going to get back. I think it's a real shame. You know, there's a lot of high profile about all the wealthy Russians who've come here and got a very high profile in society and so on. But there are also a lot of Russian professionals, a lot of Russian cultural figures who've contributed an awful lot in the last 20 years. And I think, you know, a conversation between the UK and between Russia, which was really, really difficult to hold during the Cold War, has been one of the huge benefits of its conclusion, and I fear sadly that we're going back there. I mean, I don't know when I shall next go to Russia, and I've got not the first idea of how I'd get there if I wanted to.
Sir, can you hear me? Yeah. My question is to Professor Timothy. I mean, we have seen Afghanistan fell into the hands of Taliban. It's been a tragedy in that part of the world. But isn't this a collective failure on the part of EU and the US? Because in Ukraine, this situation has been going on for 8 years. How come this society hasn't done, or Europe hasn't done much to stabilize this country?
I had some difficulty hearing that, but I think the question was, is it a collective failure on the part of the US and the EU? To which the answer is absolutely clearly yes. You know, you recognize appeasement as appeasement in retrospect. You don't always recognize it at the time. People in 1938 thought it was rather a good idea. And now we look back, and as I said, I think 2014 is really the moment. I mean, Natalia is right about 2008, but really usable after 2014. And one of the things that we clearly should have stepped up to, specifically in Britain, is all that dirty money swirling around Londongrad. I mean, you know, we are co-culpable. People talk a lot about Germany and Nord Stream 2, but we're equally responsible. But in doing that, I want to underline something James said. I hope we're capable of distinguishing between Russians and Russians, between oligarchs and others who are close to the Putin regime, and the Russians. I mean, I met one of my Russian students in the street the other day. He was almost in tears. He was so ashamed, so tormented by what Russia is doing to Ukraine. So I hope that, you know, we manage in Britain to keep our tradition of tolerance and of discrimination in that sense, in the positive sense, because most of the Russians here will undoubtedly be horrified by what Putin, not Russia, Putin, is doing to Ukraine.
Final question.
And an extension of that question then, obviously all the focus has been on Putin and his mental health, but are there any other major figures within Russia who should take some obvious responsibility for this? I mean, is this entirely Putin?
Well, the thing is that over the last 5 years, 6 years, we've seen a gradual but systematic decline in institutions. I mean, the foreign ministry, and everybody saw that, was not in charge of the situation in Ukraine or in Syria. And it was absolutely useless to talk to Lavrov about Ukraine. The same goes for the government, for instance. The government was not the institution where you have political decision actually making. And it's getting more and more centralized. You have just one body, the administration of the president. You have some people there like Patrushev, but again, he's just a close friend of Putin. They are sharing the same ideas, the same assumptions and perception of the world. the same ideology, but to be honest, these days it's about just one guy. It's about Putin, and that's it. All the rest, including Shoigu, they're just trying to guess what might be the best option for him. Maybe, as I said, Shoigu is more guilty, obviously, because he was the guy who actually was pushing this agenda that we need to invade. But apart from these two guys,
Natalia, I'd like to offer you the last word. Because I suspect you have wise things to say, but you've been sitting there, and I have a sense that you have more to give.
Oh, no pressure then. You want wisdom for the end. I would just very briefly to refer to something that Timothy was saying. I was talking to a Russian friend who said to me, which I thought was so poignant, it really feels like I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. And I think that's how so many Russians feel. The wise, I think so much of what we're seeing today, and I'll address kind of my tribe and journalists. I think so much of what we are seeing today is a result of our insatiable appetite for a very simple narrative. And I think it is our responsibility to complicate the narrative with the diversity of perspectives and angles. And because that's the only way to understand the story. And the story is going to go on and on and on. And we have to commit to it, because it's not just Ukraine's story or Russia's story, it's everyone's story now. And I think as we commit to it, I think we really, really need to try to complicate the narrative and try not to fall into this simple that trap of the simple.
So I'm going to conclude just with a personal note. Tonight we were supposed to have a talk about systematic crimes against women in theaters of war. Today, the IPCC report was issued, which didn't get the attention that it needed. And it basically sketched out an absolutely dire and catastrophic account of what confronts us. We've just emerged from a completely dislocating pandemic, which has had both public health and economic consequences. And I think one of the dangers of these moments is we allow one set of tragedies and global challenges to take away from and eclipse others. And I hope that what these gatherings do is cause us to aggregate up our resolve to try and tackle all of them, not least because it's required, but because they're deeply interrelated. And I think if there's one reason we set up the Conduit is because we want to be a place where people like you continue to gather, to continue to have these conversations. So I'm incredibly grateful to this really esteemed and erudite panel for your attention. I'm grateful for those of you who braved a strike to be here. It's the least you could do, for goodness sake. And for all those people who joined us online to listen to this, let's use the advice here to act and not just to sit and think. And the conversation will continue upstairs on the 3rd floor for those people who want to join us. But thank you to the panel. Thank you to our incredible friends who helped organize this. And thank you to you for coming.
Confidence in the victory. Anytime you see the Nazi try to in the streets.